At the court of the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, a peculiar system of relationships developed, where favorites combined the roles of close companions and influential political figures. These individuals, close to the throne, had the opportunity to participate in discussions of important state decisions, promote specific interests, and influence the appointments of high-ranking officials. However, unlike the favorites surrounding French or English monarchs, Russian favorites did not have absolute independence in their actions. Empress Catherine the Great carefully monitored their influence, preventing any of them from becoming a shadowy ruler controlling the state from behind the scenes. In European political tradition, favoritism had long-standing roots. For example, the French king Louis XIV elevated his mistresses to the rank of almost official advisors, whose opinions carried great weight. Madame de Montespan, one of Louis's favorites, actively patronized ministers and even controlled the distribution of state positions, exerting enormous influence on personnel policy. Later, during the reign of Louis XV, Madame de Pompadour not only influenced but directly interfered in international negotiations and determined who would represent France as ambassadors in various countries. In England, during the reign of Elizabeth I, her favorites, such as Robert Dudley, held high military posts, commanded armies, and virtually determined the country's political course. Catherine the Great was well aware of how much favorites could either strengthen or weaken the monarch's power. Grigory Orlov, one of her favorites, played a key role in her accession to the throne and subsequently gained considerable influence. However, when he began to display excessive ambition and strive for more power, Catherine, without the slightest hesitation, removed him from affairs, thereby showing who was in charge. Grigory Potemkin, another of her favorites, proved to be not only a close companion but also an outstanding statesman who organized the annexation of Crimea to the Russian Empire, actively developed the southern regions of the country, built cities, ports, and strengthened the army. Even after the end of their personal relationship, Potemkin remained one of the most important figures in the government, his opinions still carrying great weight. Other favorites, such as Dmitriev Mamonov or Rimsky-Korsakov, did not possess such talents and state acumen. They were more like temporary infatuations that the Empress used for entertainment, until they lost her interest. Catherine's contemporaries, especially foreign diplomats, often overestimated the influence of the favorites, mistakenly believing that Russia was ruled by the Empress's lovers. In reality, all key decisions were made personally by Catherine. If any of the favorites began to exhibit excessive self-confidence or tried to overstep the bounds, they were instantly removed from the political scene. Favorites could promote certain ideas, support specific projects, but none of them ruled the country independently. Their power and influence existed only as long as Catherine considered it useful and necessary for herself and for the state. She never allowed them to dictate policy, but used them as a tool, changing them as needed and depending on the circumstances. Grigory Orlov entered Catherine's life at a time when she felt like a stranger and was lonely at court. She arrived in Russia as a 16-year-old German princess, married off to the heir to the throne, the future Emperor Peter III. However, instead of a brilliant future, she faced humiliation and loneliness. Her husband did not love her. He openly admired the Prussian King Frederick the Great, behaved rather oddly, was fond of playing with toy soldiers, and did not even hide his mistresses. Catherine quickly realized that her position was very precarious. She had no real power, but remained at the center of the court's attention, with her every step closely watched. The only way to save herself was to ally with strong people whom she could trust and rely on. Grigory Orlov was the complete opposite of her husband. Tall, broad-shouldered, with masculine features, he did not possess the refined manners of the aristocracy, but stood out among those around him with his confidence and natural charm. He did not come from a noble family. His father was a simple artillery officer, but Orlov and his brothers made careers in military service. Grigory participated in the 7 Years' War, proved himself a brave and courageous officer, and earned respect among the soldiers. Rumors of his audacity, rough directness, and success with women circulated at court long before Catherine paid attention to him. Their first meeting probably took place during some official events, but they truly grew closer later, when Catherine began to seek allies among the military, those she could rely on in a complex political environment. She understood that if she did not create a solid foundation around herself, her future would be threatened. As time went on, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna grew older, and with her impending death, the likelihood that Peter III would get rid of his wife immediately after the coronation, sending her to a monastery or somewhere even worse, increased. Catherine knew that she had two options: to await her fate, resign to the inevitable, or to take her destiny into her own hands and start acting. Secret meetings with Orloff began as a simple attraction, but quickly grew into something much more, a strong alliance based on mutual interest and a common goal. Grigory Orloff was one of the few people with whom Catherine could speak absolutely frankly and sincerely. He did not remind her of her position as the wife of the heir to the throne, did not hide his admiration for her intelligence and beauty, and did not try to appear to be someone he was not. With him, she felt alive, a real woman, free from court intrigues and conventions. They secretly met in secluded places in the palace, used trusted servants to deliver messages, and corresponded with short notes, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. Catherine was taking a huge risk by maintaining this relationship, but with each passing day, she became more convinced that Orloff was not just a lover, but a man capable of protecting her if necessary. She needed not only a romantic interest, but also a loyal ally whom she could rely on in the struggle for power. Orloff knew the army well, had strong connections among the guard officers, and could attract them to her side, which was crucial for the implementation of her plans. Catherine certainly possessed the gift of charming people and convincing them of her rightness, but to carry out a coup d'état, more than just words were needed. Soldiers ready to take up arms against the legitimate emperor. It was Orloff and his brothers who were to become her main support in this endeavor. Their meeting truly changed the course of Russian history. Without Orloff, Catherine might have remained the unhappy and forgotten wife of Peter III, whose fate would have depended entirely on his mood and whims. The night of June 25th to June 26th, 1762, could have been the last in Catherine's life. At that moment, the fate of not only her, but of all of Russia was being decided. Everything was happening in the dark corridors of the palace, in the whispers of conspirators, and within the cold walls of the barracks. The success of the enterprise depended on speed, determination, and a willingness to risk everything they had. Catherine slept very restlessly, plagued by nightmares, when Alexei Orloff, one of Grigory's brothers, suddenly burst into her chambers. His face was tense, and his voice sounded sharp and abrupt. "Now or never, there's no more time." Catherine instantly jumped out of bed, her heart pounding as if she already heard her death sentence. She was not ready for this. At least that's what it seemed to her at first. In only her nightgown, with disheveled hair, she froze for a moment in complete shock. But it wasn't fear that paralyzed her at that moment, but the realization that this moment would either make her the Empress of all Russia or ruin her forever. Overcoming fear and doubt, barefoot on the cold floor, she approached the door. Alexei hurried her, pulled her arm, told her not to waste a minute. Grigory Orloff was already waiting for her downstairs. A carriage stood near the palace, the horses impatiently pawing the ground, snorting and shifting from foot to foot. They quickly got into the carriage and rushed through the nighttime St. Petersburg to where the fate of the country would be decided, to the barracks of the Preobrazhensky and Izmailovsky regiments, elite units of the Guards. Everything depended on how the soldiers would behave, whether they would believe her, recognize her as their new ruler, and agree to swear allegiance to her. The Orloffs had been actively working among the Guards in advance, convincing the soldiers of the need for change. Many were already calling Catherine mother, openly sympathizing with her. But sympathy is one thing, and betrayal of the reigning Tsar, the legitimate ruler of the country, is another. The carriage stopped. Catherine got out of it, throwing a soldier's greatcoat over her nightgown to warm herself a little. Her hair was disheveled, but her posture conveyed confidence and determination. A few moments of silence seemed like an eternity. It seemed that time had stopped. She raised her head and took a step forward. The soldiers looked at her, holding their breath. Then the first officer knelt down, expressing his respect. He was followed by a second. And now the whole barracks resounds with voices. "Long live Empress Catherine!" She is quickly changed into the uniform of the Preobrazhensky regiment, given a saber, and she mounts a horse. Now, before them is not a frightened woman in a nightgown, but the supreme commander of the army, ready to lead the troops. She rides at the head of the guards to the Senate building, and Grigory Orlov follows her closely, like a faithful shield and sword. By morning, all of St. Petersburg would know that Russia had a new ruler. Peter III lost his throne before he even realized what was happening. Grigory Orlov certainly saved Catherine, but that didn't make him her equal. He hoped that the coup that made her empress would bring him not only titles and riches, but also the official status of husband to the ruler, that he would become emperor consort. Catherine, though immensely grateful to him, never seriously considered this option. She understood perfectly well that marriage to Orlov would mean a division of power, and she was not going to share her throne with anyone, not even the man who helped her take it. After the coup, Orlov remained her closest favorite and wielded enormous influence at court. He not only received the title of count and vast land holdings, but he also became, in effect, the head of the government. It was on his initiative that, in the early years of Catherine's reign, an important judicial reform was carried out. Torture during interrogations was abolished, and work began on creating a new code of laws designed to modernize Russian legislation. Grigory Orlov was one of the main supporters of the policy of enlightened absolutism, which Catherine so actively promoted, but in essence, he was not a politician in the full sense of the word. Too straightforward, hot-tempered, and impulsive, he did not know how to build complex long-term combinations or weave the intrigues that were the lifeblood of high society at the time. While Catherine was engaged in complex diplomatic games, concluding advantageous alliances and attracting the best thinkers of Europe to her court, Orlov preferred to resolve any issues with brute force without being shy about the means. This approach was very effective on the battlefield, but completely unacceptable at court, where subtlety, diplomacy, and the ability to maneuver between different factions were valued. Once, when they had another frank conversation about the future, Orlov looked at her searchingly and said with the confidence of a man who was used to always getting what he wanted, "I saved you, which means you are mine." Catherine slowly raised her eyes to him, and a glint of steel flashed in them. "No, Grisha," her voice was firm and brooked no objection. "You saved Russia, and I am its mistress." He wanted to object and express everything that had accumulated in his soul, but in her tone and gaze he understood that everything had already been decided, and his opinion was no longer of interest to anyone. She did not just refuse him marriage, she made it clear to him that his role in her life had come to an end, and it was time for him to fade into the background. To somehow smooth over the break and soften the blow, Catherine gave him one of the most luxurious buildings in St. Petersburg, the magnificent marble palace, built especially for him according to the latest architectural fashion. It was a generous reward for his loyalty and devotion, but at the same time a farewell gift, symbolizing the end of their relationship. He understood perfectly well that the Empress no longer looked at him with the same interest as before. Gradually, alienation and coldness grew between them. Catherine began to surround herself with new people. Her attention was completely riveted on state affairs, on reforms, domestic policy, and the administration of a vast country. Orlov, on the other hand, was increasingly in his country estates, enjoying hunting and riotous feasts with friends, but deep down he felt that he had lost this game. In 1769, he made one last desperate attempt to regain her favor and win back her heart. He brought Catherine a gift of the legendary Orloff Trotter stallion, a magnificent white steed of rare beauty, who later became the founder of the famous Orloff Trotter breed, the pride of Russia. But even this generous and well-thought-out gesture could not change her mind. By that time, Catherine had grown so cold towards him that she sent him on a diplomatic mission to Europe, entrusting him with the solution of some minor issues. This was only a formal excuse to keep him away from the palace and out of sight. Orloff returned from Europe, but he already felt like a stranger and unwanted in the environment of the new empress, who was growing further and further away from him. In 1772, a tragic event occurred that finally broke his spirit. His wife, Ekaterina Nikolaevna Zinovieva, whom he had married after breaking up with the empress to somehow heal his emotional wounds, died. Orloff was deeply affected by her death. He withdrew into himself, stopped communicating with friends, and completely withdrew from political affairs, plunging into deep depression. Catherine ensured him a decent old age. He retained his immense wealth and all his titles, but until the end of his life he remained only a shadow of the man who once ruled the destinies of Russia and was the all-powerful favorite of the Empress. He died in 1783, already of little interest to anyone and almost forgotten. She made him great, but she also destroyed him, breaking his heart and ruining his life. Another significant favorite of Catherine was Stanislaw Poniatowski, a man who at first seemed to her like fate itself, and then became one of her biggest mistakes and disappointments. Their romance was not just a fleeting passion, it was closely intertwined with her struggle for power and for the future, with her dreams and hopes of finding a loyal ally who would stay with her forever. But time showed that Poniatowski was not at all the man she imagined him to be, and her hopes were not destined to come true. Their relationship began in 1756, when Catherine was still the wife of the heir to the throne, Peter Fedorovich. Young, intelligent, full of ambitious ambitions, but lonely and surrounded by the distrust of the court, she desperately sought a person who would understand her and support her in everything, and, as it seemed to her, she found him in the person of Stanislaw Poniatowski. Stanislaw was a Polish nobleman, a representative of an ancient but not very powerful aristocratic family. He came to Russia as part of the Polish embassy, but soon became close to the English ambassador Charles Williams, who enjoyed great influence at the Russian court. It was through the English ambassador that Catherine met Poniatowski. He was handsome, refined, educated, well-versed in politics and philosophy, and knew how to be gentle, attentive, and courteous. Against the background of a rude, uneducated, and cold husband, he seemed to her to be the ideal man, the embodiment of all her maiden dreams. Their romance flared up very quickly, like a spark in dry grass. Catherine found in him not only solace, but also the moral support that she so lacked. They met secretly, sent each other tender letters, full of love and hope, dreamed of a future in which they would be together and happy. One evening, when Poniatowski secretly made his way into her chambers through a secret passage, he gently leaned towards her, touched her hand, and whispered, "You smell like jasmine." She smiled gently in response, looked at him with a long, penetrating gaze, and quietly replied, "And you smell like Russia." There was much more in these words than just a romantic phrase. They spoke of predestination, of fate, of the fact that their connection even then went far beyond personal feelings and could play an important role in the future. Catherine sensed that her life would sooner or later change radically, and sincerely believed that Poniatowski would be by her side, supporting her in all her endeavors. However, their whirlwind romance did not remain a secret to those around them. Rumors were rife at court that the young Polish aristocrat was too often in the company of the Grand Duchess and enjoyed her special favor. Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, although she knew about this, preferred not to interfere, but many courtiers whispered behind Catherine's back that she was expecting a child, and the father might not be her legal husband, Peter Fedorovich, but Stanislaw Poniatowski. In 1757, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Anna, who unfortunately died in infancy, but disputes and gossip about her true origin did not subside for a long time. After the death of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, Catherine's position at court became even more complex and uncertain. Peter Fedorovich, who became Emperor Peter III, completely distrusted his wife and could well use her connection with Poniatowski as a convenient pretext for divorce and removing her from the political scene. In 1758, he gave a direct order to Stanislaw Poniatowski to immediately leave Russia. Catherine said goodbye to him in tears, but firmly promised that their paths would definitely cross again in the future. Despite the separation, their correspondence continued even after Poniatowski's departure. Catherine wrote to him in detail about her desperate struggle for power, about how she was preparing step by step for future changes and making plans for the future. Poniatowski returned to Poland, but their fates were still closely linked, and they were to meet again. A few years later, when Catherine herself became empress, she did not forget about her beloved for a minute. In 1764, with her active support and direct intervention, he was elected King of Poland. Then it seemed to Catherine that this was a new chapter in their shared history, that he would rule the country as wisely and decisively as she did, with ambitions and far-reaching plans. But soon she realized that Poniatowski was not at all the man she thought he was. He turned out to be too soft, indecisive, and weak a ruler, who was completely dependent on the political and financial support of Russia and completely unable to independently retain power in the country. The love that once seemed to Catherine to be salvation and the only hope for happiness eventually turned into a serious political miscalculation. She made him king, but very soon realized that he was completely unsuited for power and unable to effectively govern the state. Stanislaw Poniatowski became King of Poland solely thanks to Catherine's support, and from the very beginning his power was entirely dependent on Russia. In 1764, after the death of the Polish king August III, the throne of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became vacant, and a struggle for power began between various political groups. Catherine understood perfectly well that Poland had to remain under her control, and she simply had no better candidate than Stanislaw Poniatowski. He had no powerful allies, lacked sufficient military authority, and most importantly, was not strong or independent enough to govern Poland without her constant assistance and support. Russian troops were deployed into Poland, putting pressure on the local nobility, while magnates bribed by Russian agents actively supported Stanislaw's candidacy. Catherine used all her diplomatic influence and military might to ensure his election to the Polish throne. As a result, in September of 1764, he was officially proclaimed King of Poland. But his crown was merely a symbol, devoid of real power. The Polish Sejm, comprised of headstrong nobles, did not take him seriously at all, and the powerful magnates continued to dictate their terms to him and pursue their own interests. He sincerely wanted to reform the country, strengthen the king's power, weaken the influence of the nobility, and limit their numerous privileges. But all his good intentions and attempts to implement reforms met with fierce resistance from the Polish aristocracy. Catherine initially supported his reformist ideas, but only as long as they did not begin to threaten Russian influence in the region. When he proposed changing the outdated electoral system in Poland, limiting the rights of magnates, and creating a strong central government, Catherine immediately distanced herself from him and made it clear that she would never tolerate the existence of an independent and strong Poland capable of pursuing its own policies. In 1768, a large-scale uprising of the Bar Confederation broke out in Poland, a union of nobles fiercely opposed to Russian interference in the country's internal affairs. Poniatowski found himself caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he could not cope with the rebellious insurgents without Catherine's help. On the other hand, Constant Russian military and political support made him even more dependent on her and undermined his authority in the eyes of the Polish people. Russian troops brutally suppressed the uprising, but after that, Poland could no longer be considered an independent state. It effectively became a Russian protectorate. In 1772, the first partition of Poland took place. Russia, Prussia, and Austria, pursuing their own geopolitical interests, reached an agreement among themselves and cut off large territories from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland was rapidly losing its influence in Europe, and its king was turning into a helpless puppet in the hands of the great powers. Poniatowski desperately tried to resist, writing tearful letters to Catherine, begging her to preserve the integrity of Poland, but she answered him with increasing coldness and evasiveness. He still held a faint hope that some warm feelings remained between them, but Catherine had long ceased to perceive him as an equal person or politician. In 1790, after another political crisis in Poland, Catherine sent him a short letter. It was dry, official, and devoid of the warm words and expressions he was accustomed to. "You are no longer my king," she wrote succinctly, drawing a line under their long-standing relationship. In 1792, the second partition of Poland took place. Russia and Prussia seized even more territories from Poland, and Poniatowski himself was forced to sign the humiliating Grodno Sejm, effectively acknowledging that Poland no longer had the right to independence and was a vassal of the Russian Empire. He again turned to Catherine for help, writing her letters, proposing various options for saving the state. But she had long ceased to consider it her business and was not going to interfere in the events unfolding. In 1794, an uprising broke out under the leadership of Tadeusz Kościuszko, becoming the last desperate attempt by the Polish people to save their country from complete destruction. Catherine responded to this uprising with all her cruelty. Russian troops entered Warsaw, suppressed the uprising, and in 1795, Poland finally ceased to exist as an independent state. Stanislaw Poniatowski signed the Act of Abdication and became the last king of a country that had disappeared from the map of Europe. Catherine sent him into exile in Grodno, where he lived for several years under the constant supervision of Russian officers. He never wrote to her again, realizing that their connection was finally broken. In 1796, Catherine died, and 2 years later, in 1798, Stanislaw Poniatowski also passed away, crushed by grief and disappointment. Grigory Potemkin was perhaps one of the most influential and significant people in the court of Empress Catherine II. Unlike many other favorites, he was not only in personal proximity to the Empress, but also took an active part in the management of the vast state, engaging in politics, military affairs, economics, and the development of new territories. His contribution to the development and strengthening of the Russian Empire was so significant that many historians consider him not just a favorite, but the actual co-ruler of Catherine, a man who largely determined the country's political course. Their first meeting took place during the palace coup of 1762, when Potemkin was a young officer in the Guard and took an active part in the overthrow of Emperor Peter III. At that moment, Catherine did not pay much attention to him, but even then he showed himself as a man with great ambitions and unwavering loyalty to the new government. After the coup, Potemkin received a promotion, but for several years he retreated into the shadows, minding his own business and not striving for publicity. His real rise began in 1769, when he returned to court and managed to attract Catherine's attention with his sharp mind, sparkling wit, and extraordinary strategic thinking. He was not only a talented military leader, but also a superb organizer, able to quickly and effectively solve complex administrative issues. It was during this period that their close relationship began, and a passionate romance ensued. Potemkin quickly gained political weight and influence at court. In 1770, he received the rank of Major General. In 1774, he particularly distinguished himself during the Russo-Turkish War, skillfully leading the cavalry and participating in the most important military operations. For his displayed courage and heroism, he was awarded the highest military order of St. George. Catherine saw in him a man who not only knew how to fight successfully, but also possessed the talent to effectively manage vast territories and make responsible decisions of great importance to the state. In 1775, Potemkin received one of the most important and responsible posts in the empire, Governor-General of New Russia. He was given a vast territory that included the modern southern regions of Russia and Ukraine. Here he launched large-scale work to populate these lands, build new cities, roads, and develop infrastructure. It was on his initiative that such important cities as Kherson, Nikolaev, and Ekaterinoslav, now Dnipro, were founded. In 1783, Catherine entrusted Potemkin with the management of Crimea, which had just been annexed to Russia after the victory in the Russo-Turkish War. This became his most significant and large-scale project, requiring enormous effort and resources. Potemkin understood perfectly well that Crimea was a strategically important region that needed to be strengthened, populated, and integrated into the Russian Empire. He organized the resettlement of Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, and Armenian families to Crimea, built roads, fortresses, ports, and developed agriculture. It was he who founded the city of Sevastopol, which soon became the main base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. In 1787, Catherine made a famous journey to Crimea, during which Potemkin demonstrated to her the impressive fruits of his tireless work. The legend of the so-called Potemkin villages, supposedly built to create the appearance of prosperity in the region and deceive the empress, is largely exaggerated and does not correspond to reality. In fact, Potemkin did carry out large-scale work to develop Crimea, but to make an even greater impression on Catherine, he organized staged scenes with supposedly prosperous villages and happy locals to show her how the region had transformed under his leadership. One of Potemkin's most ambitious and grandiose projects was the so-called Greek project. He passionately dreamed of organizing a large-scale campaign on Constantinople, planned the restoration of the Byzantine Empire under the protectorate of Russia, and even harbored the idea of putting one of the Russian heirs on the imperial throne of Byzantium. It was on his initiative that Russia was actively preparing for a large-scale offensive against the Ottoman Empire, creating a powerful fleet and strengthening the southern borders of the state. There is also a version that in 1770, Catherine and Potemkin secretly married, sealing their union not only with political but also with spiritual bonds. Although there is no direct and irrefutable evidence of this fact, their personal correspondence and style of communication suggest that their relationship was much deeper and more serious than just a romantic affair. Catherine often called him "my friend," "my husband" in her letters, and Potemkin in turn addressed her as his spouse, which also indirectly confirms the version of a secret marriage. Despite his immense influence and proximity to the empress, over time, Potemkin began to spend more and more time away from court, engaging in important military and administrative affairs in New Russia and Crimea. In 1791, he went to negotiate with the Ottoman Empire in order to conclude a peace that was beneficial to Russia, but he suddenly fell ill on the way. In October of that year, he passed away, presumably from malaria or a sudden heart attack. Grigory Potemkin was perhaps Catherine the Great's only favorite, who, upon losing his status as her lover, not only maintained his influence, but also continued to lead crucial government projects of strategic importance to Russia. Unlike most other favorites, who were usually removed from power and sent into honorable exile after breaking up with the empress, Potemkin remained a key figure in the empire, shaping its domestic and foreign policy. Their relationship was based not only on personal feelings and mutual affection, but also on a shared political strategy aimed at strengthening Russia's power. Therefore, even after the romantic connection faded, Catherine could not afford to lose such a valuable and experienced statesman. Over time, their personal closeness gradually weakened, and their correspondence became less frequent and more formal. Catherine wrote him fewer warm letters, and Potemkin spent more and more time away from the court, dealing with state affairs and solving important problems. However, his political influence and authority in the country did not diminish at all. He continued to implement large-scale reforms in New Russia, developed the Black Sea Fleet, and created strategic fortifications on Russia's southern borders, preparing for potential conflicts with Turkey and other powers. Despite the growing dissatisfaction of the courtiers with his excessive ambitions and enormous government spending, Catherine did not interfere in his activities, fully aware of his exceptional nature and indispensability to the state. After officially breaking up with Catherine, Potemkin focused exclusively on military and administrative affairs. In 1787, a new Russo-Turkish war began, and Potemkin led the southern front, becoming commander-in-chief of all Russian troops in the region. Under his command were the army, the navy, and all defensive structures along the entire Black Sea coast. In December 1788, his troops captured the Turkish fortress of Ochakov after several months of stubborn siege. This triumph significantly strengthened Russian influence in the Black Sea and became Potemkin's greatest success as a talented military leader and military strategist. Potemkin also played a key role in managing the new territories annexed to Russia as a result of the Russo-Turkish Wars. He personally developed plans for their settlement, created administrative structures, strengthened strategically important military facilities, and developed the economy of these regions. On his initiative, important cities such as Tiraspol and Simferopol were founded, becoming important centers of trade and Russian military presence in the south. He initiated a large-scale government program to relocate people to southern Russia, attracting peasants, artisans, and Cossacks to develop new lands and agriculture. After the war ended, he actively pursued the implementation of the so-called Greek project. This project involved detailed strategies to establish complete Russian control over Constantinople and to restore the Byzantine Empire under the patronage of the Romanov dynasty. It included preparing Russian-Greek troops for a joint campaign in the Balkans, actively engaging in diplomatic efforts with European powers to gain their support, and developing detailed military plans to capture strategically important territories of the Ottoman Empire. He personally oversaw the strengthening of the Black Sea Fleet, the development of a strategy for attacking the Ottoman Empire, and the formation of military alliances with the Balkan peoples who sought liberation from Turkish rule. However, Catherine understood that the implementation of this ambitious project would require enormous financial resources and could provoke a large-scale military conflict with Western countries, which were not interested in strengthening Russian influence in the region. Therefore, she was in no hurry to implement it immediately, preferring to act cautiously and gradually. Despite the break in personal relations with Catherine, Potemkin remained a key political figure in the Russian Empire until the end of his life, wielding enormous influence on key decisions. Even after new favorites appeared, his political influence did not weaken at all. Catherine continued to entrust him with resolving key issues of foreign policy and military strategy, understanding that he had no equal in these areas. He rarely visited the court, preferring to stay away from intrigues and gossip, but his decrees and orders were carried out by all officials with the same unwavering precision as if they had come from the Empress herself. In 1791, Potemkin went to the city of Iasi to conduct peace negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, seeking to conclude a peace treaty that would be beneficial to Russia and would consolidate its influence in the region. By that time, he was suffering from serious health problems caused by chronic diseases. Long military campaigns, constant nervous tension, a huge workload, and an unhealthy lifestyle had severely undermined his strength and weakened his body. In the fall of that year, during a grueling trip between Bessarabia and Iasi, he felt a sharp deterioration in his condition, and it became clear that his illness was progressing. After getting out of the carriage, he could no longer continue the journey. He became very ill and soon died in the arms of his faithful servants. According to one of the most common versions, the immediate cause of death was malaria, which he had contracted in the southern regions of Russia. According to another, it was a sudden heart attack caused by overwork and nervous strain. The news of his sudden death shocked Catherine like a bolt from the blue. Although she had other favorites by that point, none of them could compare with Potemkin in terms of influence, intellect, talent, and the enormous role he had played in her life and reign. She did not hold lavish mourning ceremonies or publicly mourn his death, but in her private letters to close friends and relatives, she remembered him with unwavering warmth and sincere gratitude. After his death, no one remained at court who possessed such an exceptional position and the Empress's trust. Potemkin has forever remained in Russian history as Catherine's only favorite, who not only retained power and influence after breaking off personal relations with the Empress, but also continued to successfully manage crucial state processes, even from afar. Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov became Catherine the Great's favorite during that period of her life, when personal relations with those close to her were increasingly losing their political significance and becoming more of a pleasant pastime than a means of governing the state. Unlike Grigory Orlov, who helped her ascend the throne and carry out a coup, or Grigory Potemkin, who led the development of southern territories and headed important military campaigns, Mamonov possessed neither outstanding state nor military talents. His main merits were youth, attractive appearance, pleasant manners, and the ability to behave at court, entertaining the Empress and creating a good mood for her. In the last years of Catherine's reign, her favorites no longer became her political allies and advisors, as they had been in the first decades of her reign, but played the role of personal companions, brightening her leisure time and creating an atmosphere of lightness and carefree entertainment. Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov came from an ancient noble family, known since the 16th century. His family was among the noble, but not the most influential aristocratic families in Russia. However, he himself, before his sudden rise, played no significant role at court and did not hold high government positions. He began his service in the Preobrazhensky regiment, which was traditionally considered an elite unit of the Russian Guard, from which those close to the monarchs often emerged and occupied important posts in the state. In the Guard, he gained a reputation as an affable, courteous, and attractive young man, which played a key role in his future rise at court. In 1786, Catherine noticed him, and soon a passionate romance began between them. In 1787, he became her official favorite, and his career skyrocketed. As usually happened with most of Catherine's favorites, she generously showered him with various favors, awards, and high positions. He received the high rank of adjutant general, although he had no real military experience and had never participated in combat. He was granted wealthy estates, receiving vast landholdings with thousands of serfs. Such a rapid and undeserved rise of Mamonov caused discontent and envy at court. Unlike Catherine's previous favorites, who made significant contributions to strengthening Russian power and had a real impact on state policy, Mamonov showed no interest or ability in managing state affairs. He did not participate in political discussions, did not interfere in matters of reform and foreign policy, and did not seek to expand his personal influence at court. This sharply distinguished him from Potemkin, who, after the end of his personal relationship with Catherine, retained enormous power and continued to play a leading role in governing the vast empire. Despite the high military ranks assigned to him, his service in the army was a mere formality. He never participated in combat, did not command troops, and had no real merits that could justify his rapid career advancement. His entire position was based solely on Catherine's personal affection, who enjoyed spending time in his company and listening to his flattering speeches. At court, he was seen more as a handsome and lucky young man who simply happened to be in the right place at the right time than as a serious political figure capable of influencing the course of state affairs. European diplomats stationed at the Russian court regularly reported to their capitals that the Empress's new favorite exerted absolutely no influence on state affairs and did not participate in important political decisions. The correspondence of foreign ambassadors frequently mentioned that he was entirely absorbed in the role of Catherine's companion, merely entertaining her with his conversations and witticisms without interfering in serious matters. Yet, despite the numerous conversations and critical remarks, Catherine continued to show him her favor and give him much attention. For her, he was a kind of symbol of youth, lightness, and freedom from the numerous worries and problems that increased as she aged and the international situation grew more complex. Unlike her previous favorites, Mamonov did not try to influence her decisions, did not argue with her on political matters, did not lobby for the interests of his supporters, but simply enjoyed his high position at court, deriving pleasure and material benefits from it. Although his rise seemed very rapid and dizzying, his position at court remained extremely precarious and depended solely on the Empress's mood. Unlike those favorites who managed to strengthen their power through faithful service to the state and the implementation of important political projects, Mamonov depended solely on Catherine's personal favor and had no other sources of influence. He had neither influential political allies nor real power outside the palace. Any, even insignificant, change in the Empress's mood could lead to his immediate downfall, since, unlike Orlov or Potemkin, he possessed neither his own army nor an extensive network of patrons and supporters. Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov, who seemed an unshakable favorite of Empress Catherine II, went down in history not for his merits in public service, but because of one of the most scandalous infidelities at the Russian court, which caused a great stir in high society. His rapid rise was as sudden and dizzying as his fall. But, unlike other favorites who lost the Empress's favor due to political intrigues or the appearance of new contenders for her heart, he personally destroyed his brilliant career, grossly violating the unwritten rules of favoritism that were strictly observed at court. By the beginning of 1789, Mamonov occupied a solid position at court. He was lavishly showered with favors, owned vast estates, received huge incomes, and formerly held the high military rank of adjutant general. However, his status rested solely on Catherine's personal favor and had no other foundation. He had no independent political influence, no military merits, and had not built a network of loyal allies around himself who could support him in difficult times. Contemporaries noted that lately he had become increasingly cold and aloof towards the Empress, showed boredom in her company, and even allowed a hint of indifference in his communication with her. Unlike Grigory Potemkin, who, even after losing his status as a favorite, continued to be one of the most powerful people in the empire, Mamonov completely failed to use his high position to strengthen his own power and influence. He perceived it solely as a source of personal comfort and material well-being, not caring about the future. Rumors that he harbored tender feelings for one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Daria Fedorovna Sherbatova, began to spread at court even before their affair became apparent and ceased to be a secret to those around them. Daria Sherbatova came from a noble aristocratic family. Her ancestors held high positions at court and enjoyed great influence. But unlike many other court ladies, she was distinguished by modesty, a gentle disposition, sincere kindness, and devotion to the Empress. Catherine valued her very highly, considering her one of the most decent and honest women in her circle whom she could trust. The connection between Mamonov and Sherbatova became quite obvious to those around them when he began to openly show her signs of attention and pay her all sorts of attentions. This caused a real shock at court, as the Empress's favorites could not afford such liberties, especially with regard to ladies-in-waiting. They received incredible privileges and wealth, but in return, they were expected to show absolute loyalty and devotion only to the Empress. Rumors of their secret romance very quickly reached Catherine, and soon she learned the whole truth. Her reaction to the betrayal was unexpected and surprised many courtiers. Instead of rage, anger, and a desire for revenge, as many expected, she acted quite differently. The Empress generously allowed Mamonov to marry Shcherbatova, but with one strict condition. He was to leave the court immediately and forever, and never appear in her presence again. Such a generous and noble act was completely atypical for European courts of that era, where betrayal of royal favor could mean exile to Siberia, life imprisonment in a gloomy prison, or even execution by beheading. Catherine, despite the personal insult and betrayal, simply erased him from her life, as if he had never existed. In 1789, Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov and Daria Shcherbatova went into voluntary exile to one of his remote estates, forever losing all their former influence, wealth, and high status at court. Remaining away from metropolitan life, Mamonov very soon realized what a fatal mistake he had made, exchanging the Empress's favor for a fleeting infatuation. The luxurious life at court, the constant attention from the Empress, unlimited opportunities for self-realization, power, wealth, and fame. All this disappeared in an instant, as if it had never existed. He found himself in the backwoods, on his estate, away from the noisy metropolitan life and court intrigues, and very quickly fell into deep despondency and melancholy. At first, he tried to get used to the new, quiet and measured life, but the years spent in luxury and idleness completely unprepared him for a secluded existence away from court. Contemporaries reported that his condition only worsened over time. He suffered from severe depression, stopped communicating with neighbors, and began to avoid the company of even his closest friends and relatives, and later fell into deep religious despair. Some historical sources claim that he even began to see his exile as divine punishment for betrayal and ingratitude towards the Empress. Shcherbatova, devoted to him to the end and sincerely in love with him, did everything possible to support him during this difficult period of his life and somehow alleviate his suffering, but unfortunately, her efforts were not enough. He died in 1823, several decades after his inglorious exile from St. Petersburg. Although his life ended far from the court and was not marked by any significant events, the story of his sudden fall became one of the most discussed and instructive in Catherine's circle. Mamonov never managed to return to his former life, and his sad fate became a stern reminder that even favorites who have everything can lose absolutely everything in an instant due to one wrong step taken out of their own stupidity. Platon Alexandrovich Zubov entered the life of Empress Catherine II in the very last years of her long reign and became her last favorite, destined to remain in history. His unexpected rise symbolized not only a change in the personal preferences of the aging empress, but also a profound transformation of the very institution of favoritism in Russia, which was gradually losing its political significance. If earlier Catherine's favorites were outstanding military and statesmen such as Grigory Orlov or Grigory Potemkin, then by the end of her life they were turning more into court companions, designed to brighten the Empress's leisure time and create a good mood for her, rather than influence the course of state affairs. However, despite the complete absence of any outstanding talents, Zubov managed not only to stay close to Catherine, but also to exert a significant influence on her inner circle and politics, albeit not always in the interests of the state. Platon Zubov was born in 1767 into the family of a not-so-wealthy nobleman. His family did not belong to the largest and most influential aristocratic clans in Russia, but he came from a military background, and his ancestors had faithfully served the fatherland for many years. By the time he met Catherine, he was serving in the Life Guards Horse Regiment, which was traditionally considered one of the most prestigious units in the Russian army, where young nobles with good connections and the prospect of rapid advancement through the ranks were accepted into service. Despite the absence of any special military merits, his attractive appearance, courteous manners, and ability to charm those around him played a key role in his future fate and contributed to his rapid rise at court. In 1790, when Catherine was already in her 60s, Zubov was presented to the Empress and very soon became her new favorite, replacing the previous one who had lost her favor. His youth, elegance, gallantry, and natural charm made a strong impression on Catherine, and she quickly brought him closer to her, surrounding him with care and attention. After that, his career began to develop simply at a rapid pace. Within a few months, he received vast land holdings, generous monetary grants, high titles, and numerous honors. In 1791, he became adjutant general, then general field marshal, and just 2 years later, general-in-chief, receiving the highest military rank in the Russian army. However, unlike the favorites of previous years, his high ranks were more decorative in nature and did not correspond to his real abilities. He showed absolutely no interest in military service, did not participate in the development of military campaigns, and did not engage in strengthening the country's defense capabilities. Despite a complete lack of political experience and knowledge in the field of public administration, Zubov very quickly acquired immense influence at court, enjoying the Empress's special favor. Catherine showered him generously with various graces, and many important state appointments began to pass through him, as well as financial issues being resolved. He effectively became an intermediary between the Empress and her ministers, and many courtiers and officials sought to win his favor at any cost in order to advance in their careers or obtain a lucrative contract. He gained particularly great influence in financial matters and the distribution of state revenues, which allowed him and his numerous entourage to derive considerable personal benefit from their high position. Contemporaries noted that many of his decisions were dictated not by the interests of the state, but solely by the personal sympathies and mercenary motives of the favorite. But Zubov was most criticized at court for his excessive extravagance and insatiable lust for wealth. Catherine generously presented him with luxurious palaces, expensive jewelry, and large sums of money, but he spent it all with astonishing ease, hosting lavish balls, giving expensive receptions, and living in unprecedented luxury. His expenses grew every year, and courtiers whispered about his capriciousness, arrogance, and insolence. Foreign diplomats stationed in Russia regularly reported to their capitals that the Empress's latest favorite behaved more like an oriental despot than a statesman concerned with the interests of his country. Despite a complete lack of any real merit to the fatherland, Zubov tried to actively participate in foreign policy, interfering in matters he knew absolutely nothing about. In 1792, Russia began a new war with the Ottoman Empire, and although the actual leadership of the military campaigns was carried out by experienced generals, Zubov was appointed the de facto supervisor of the war, gaining enormous power over the army and navy. In 1794, he accompanied the Russian army on a campaign to Persia, which was part of Russia's grand geopolitical strategy in the region aimed at strengthening its influence in the Middle East. Although he did not directly participate in the fighting, his name constantly appeared in all official documents as one of the main organizers of this military campaign. However, his influence at court was completely incomparable to the enormous role that Grigory Potemkin played during his period of power. Zubov had neither loyal allies, nor military support, nor independent political weight that would have allowed him to pursue his line without regard to the Empress's opinion. All his power rested solely on Catherine's personal favor, and if she turned away from him, he would instantly lose everything. Unlike Potemkin, who remained an influential political figure even after the end of his personal relationship with the Empress, Zubov was completely dependent on her favor and was nothing without her support. Catherine herself, blinded by his youth and beauty, stubbornly turned a blind eye to all his numerous shortcomings and ignored criticism from her inner circle, who could clearly see that Zubov was abusing his position and thinking only of his own enrichment. However, his position at court turned out to be far more precarious and vulnerable than he could have imagined in his worst nightmares. On the night of November 6, 1796, Catherine suddenly suffered a severe stroke and died a few hours later without regaining consciousness. The very next morning, Platon Zubov was disgracefully removed from the palace. The new emperor Paul I, who had hated his mother's favorites all his life and considered them the main evil of Russia, immediately stripped him of all his positions, confiscated all his property, and sent him into exile to his remote estate. Thus, ingloriously and unexpectedly, ended the career of the last favorite of Catherine II. His sudden rise and rapid fall became a kind of symbol of how the institution of favoritism had changed in Russia by the end of Catherine's reign. If earlier favorites could play an important role in governing a vast country, by the end of Catherine's reign, they increasingly became courtiers whose influence was limited exclusively to personal relationships with the empress and did not extend beyond the palace walls. Zubov, who received power solely thanks to his attractive appearance and youth, failed to leave any noticeable mark in the history of Russia as a politician, reformer, or talented military leader. He became the last person to hold on to Catherine's throne, but at the moment of her death, he lost everything he had and turned into nothing. Platon Zubov, the last favorite of Empress Catherine II, remained by her side until her death, and his name is inextricably linked to the last days of her life, shrouded in mystery and rumors. Although the official version states that the empress died of a stroke, her sudden death spawned a wide variety of rumors and suspicions of violent death, which still stir the minds of historians and history buffs alike. Conspiracies, intrigues, and a fierce struggle for power at the Russian court have always been an integral part of the country's political life, and Catherine's death came at a time when too many people were eagerly awaiting her departure to begin the fight for the throne. The main beneficiary of her death was her son Paul I, whom she did not love, and whom, according to rumors, she was going to deprive of his legitimate right to the throne in favor of her beloved grandson, Alexander. In the last years of the empress's life, her inner circle became increasingly closed and narrow, and her well-being gradually deteriorated. Despite outward activity and energy, Catherine suffered from frequent attacks of dizziness and shortness of breath, which could indicate problems with blood vessels that were precursors to a stroke. Nevertheless, there were no serious signs of impending death, and nothing foreshadowed an imminent demise. She continued to actively engage in state affairs, discussed military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and Persia with her confidants, prepared new decrees, and made plans for the future. November 5, 1796. The day passed in the tense rhythm typical of the Empress. Catherine read reports from ministers, discussed current issues with Zubov, received foreign ambassadors, and granted audiences to courtiers. In the evening, the Winter Palace was filled with the lively and festive atmosphere typical of that time, but among those close to her, disturbing conversations were already taking place, and vague premonitions hung in the air. Paul, who had lived for many years waiting for his turn to the throne and felt deprived of his mother's attention, gradually increased his influence at court, attracting those dissatisfied with the Empress's policies to his side. Many aristocrats, unhappy that Catherine had hesitated for too long to transfer power or at least officially designate an heir to the throne, began to think more and more about imminent changes in the country. Among the favorites, who understood perfectly well that their fate depended directly on the personal favor of the aging empress, the tension was especially high, as they understood that with her death, their influence and wealth would instantly disappear. Zubov, who by that time had amassed immense wealth and achieved a high status in society, also felt a growing anxiety and vague unease. He understood perfectly well that he possessed neither real military power nor extensive political connections that could protect him in the event of a sudden change of power, and his future looked very vague and uncertain. The next morning, November 6th, Catherine, as usual, woke up early and went to her dressing room to tidy herself up. But after a while, she was found lying unconscious on the floor, which caused real panic among her entourage. She was immediately taken to the bedroom, where the best doctors from all over St. Petersburg were gathered, but unfortunately, they proved powerless and could not help her. The Empress never regained consciousness and died a few hours later, leaving behind many unresolved questions and mysteries. At this moment, real chaos and haste began in the palace, with each courtier trying to occupy a more advantageous position in the new political reality. Paul immediately went to the Winter Palace to take the reins of power into his own hands and prevent any surprises. And Zubov, who in the morning was one of the most powerful and influential people in the empire, soon found himself pushed away from the center of events and lost all power. The mysterious and tragic circumstances of her death spawned a wide variety of rumors, speculation, and conspiracy theories. Some argued that the stroke was a natural consequence of old age and a stressful life full of stress and anxiety. Others believed that her death could have been accelerated and of a violent nature. Those who suspected a conspiracy drew particular attention to the extraordinary speed with which Paul seized power and to the hasty removal of Zubov and other favorites of the deceased empress, which looked very suspicious. Among the possible participants in the conspiracy were named both Paul's most loyal supporters and people from Catherine's inner circle, who may have feared her new political decisions and sought to prevent possible changes at any cost. Paul had long made no secret of his negative attitude towards his mother's favorites, especially Zubov, whom he considered one of the main symbols of the decadence and decay of her reign, mired in luxury and immorality. Platon Zubov found himself in an extremely difficult and ambiguous position. On the one hand, he was with the Empress in the very last days of her life and could have been aware of a conspiracy being prepared against her. On the other hand, his immediate removal from the palace after her death seemed too hasty and suspicious, suggesting that he either knew too much or was one of those whom the new authorities wanted to eliminate first in order to cover their tracks. Contemporaries wrote that at that moment he looked completely shocked and dejected, as if he had not expected such a sudden and inglorious end to his brilliant career at court. If he knew about a possible conspiracy, he clearly could not have foreseen how quickly his influence and wealth would turn to nothing. Historians still debate whether the suspicion of conspiracy was justified and whether it had any real basis. Direct and irrefutable evidence that Catherine was poisoned or that her death was deliberately hastened has yet to be found, and the truth is likely to remain buried forever in the annals of history. Life at the court of Empress Catherine II was full of not only brilliance, luxury, and endless festivities, but also a hidden struggle for influence, where the favorites played a key role in determining the country's political course. Their position at court was not limited to the role of mere companions to the Empress. They gained direct access to important state affairs, financial management, and, in some cases, the leadership of military campaigns. However, the path to favoritism was extremely difficult and thorny, and was accompanied by constant intrigues, behind-the-scenes struggles, and complex webs of court politics that one had to understand and survive. Catherine's favorites appeared at court by no means by chance, and their rise was the result of the Empress's purposeful policy. Unlike some European monarchs, who could choose their lovers solely on the basis of physical appearance and personal preferences, Catherine preferred men who could not only entertain her and brighten her leisure time, but also benefit the state, demonstrating their talents in various fields. She highly valued intelligence, charisma, education, and political acumen. For example, Grigory Orlov, one of her very first favorites, was not just the Empress's lover, but also a key participant in the palace coup of 1762, which brought Catherine to power and made her the autocratic ruler of a vast empire. Grigory Potemkin, perhaps the only favorite who became her de facto co-ruler and exerted enormous influence on all spheres of life in the state, not only inspired the Empress with his ideas and advice, but also personally oversaw the annexation of Crimea to Russia and was actively involved in the development of the country's southern territories, transforming them into a prosperous region. Claimants to the role of Catherine's favorite appeared mainly from among the Guards officers. The lifeguards of the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments, as well as the horse guards, served as a kind of personnel reserve from which the Empress selected her confidants, elevating them to the highest state ranks. Young nobles from these elite military units sought to attract the Empress's attention at any cost, hoping to make a brilliant career at court. But the chances of gaining her favor depended not only on their physical attractiveness or military achievements, but also on many other factors. Court intrigues and the support of influential political groups interested in promoting one candidate or another for the role of favorite played an important role in this complex process. Court ladies, maids of honor, and even foreign ambassadors could actively promote their protégés, hoping that if he rose to prominence, he would not forget the assistance provided to him. Thus, in the case of Stanislaw Poniatowski, the future King of Poland, the English ambassador Charles Williams played a major role in his rise, skillfully facilitating his rapprochement with Catherine even before she ascended the throne, promoting him as his protégé. Poniatowski became the Empress's favorite not only because of his personal charm, education, and pleasant manners, but also as part of a carefully crafted British diplomatic strategy aimed at strengthening England's influence in Russia and Poland. However, the struggle for a place next to the Empress was not limited to competition between young Guards officers seeking to make a brilliant career. Within the palace, there was a complex and convoluted system of intrigues in which maids of honor and court ladies played a key role, wielding enormous influence over the fates of favorites. They could actively support some candidates and ruthlessly eliminate others, guided by their own interests and personal sympathies. One striking example of such court intrigues was the case of Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov, Catherine's favorite in 1786 to 1789. When he recklessly fell in love with one of the Empress's maids of honor, Daria Fedorovna Sherbatova, malicious court ladies immediately reported this to Catherine, hoping to get rid of the annoying favorite. The Empress, upon learning of the betrayal, first removed him from the court and then sent him into honorable exile to his remote estate, stripping him of all titles and wealth. Some maids of honor not only participated in intrigues, but also actively influenced the fate of favorites, deciding who would live and who would die politically. Thus, Maria Savishna Perekusikina, who enjoyed Catherine's special favor, had a reputation as a woman who could ruin anyone she did not like by spreading dirty rumors and gossip about him. Denunciations, slander, and sometimes even direct accusations of treason, which could cost the favorite not only his career but also his life, passed through her. At the same time, other maids of honor, on the contrary, actively promoted their protégés, hoping that the new favorite, having risen with their help, would provide them with influence and support at court. Even after becoming the Empress's favorite and reaching the heights of power, a man could not feel completely safe and be sure of his future. The slightest mistake, a wrong word, or a careless act could lead to his immediate downfall and ignominious expulsion from the palace. This is what happened to Platon Zubov, Catherine's last favorite, whose fate turned out to be sad and instructive. After her sudden death, he was immediately removed from the palace, and the new Emperor Paul I, who harbored hatred for his mother's favorites, stripped him of all titles, ranks, privileges, and immense wealth, sending him into exile. Thus, Catherine's favorites were not only lovers and temporary companions of the Empress, but also key figures in the complex and convoluted political game unfolding at court. Their rise depended not only on their personal abilities and natural charm, but also on their ability to skillfully navigate court intrigues, recognize the machinations of envious people in time, and avoid the traps set by numerous rivals who dreamed of taking their place at the throne. In this cruel and hypocritical world, full of brilliance, luxury, and permissiveness, every careless step could be the last and lead to complete collapse.